guardian of Gotham's darkest hours, to the slow chronicle of a mind at war with itself, a story not of villains defeated or cities saved, but of the quiet, incremental cost of becoming something that could not stop. Tonight we trace the deterioration that hides inside the victory, the specific quality of damage that accumulates in a person who decided, at the age of 8, that grief was a blueprint, and that the only acceptable response to powerlessness was to become the most powerful thing in the room. Settle in, let the rain find the windows. There is no need to hold on to every detail, only let the darkness carry you, gently, into what it cost him to be what he was. There is a particular kind of wound that does not bleed. It does not announce itself in the hours after the injury, does not produce the immediate crisis that draws attention and treatment and the organized response of people who understand that something has gone wrong. It simply waits, embedding itself in the architecture of the person it has claimed, shaping the growth that follows from the inside out, invisible to every examination that looks only at the surface. The wound that Bruce Wayne carried out of Crime Alley on the night his parents died was this kind of wound, not the grief, which was visible and acknowledged and attended to in the way that the grief of orphan children is attended to, but something beneath the grief, something that the grief concealed even as it expressed it, a specific quality of psychological rupture that would not reveal its full dimensions until decades had passed, and the person who carried it had built an entire life around the specific shape of the damage without ever fully understanding that this was what he was doing. The night itself was not extraordinary by the standards of the city in which it occurred. Gotham had always produced moments of this kind, desperate people making desperate choices in the narrow spaces between wealth and poverty, between the comfortable assumptions of the privileged and the grinding reality of those for whom the social contract had never delivered on its promises. Joe Chill was not a monster in any cosmic sense. He was a man in need, standing in the shadows of a city that had failed to meet that need through any legitimate means, who made the specific calculation that the well-dressed family that had wandered within reach represented an opportunity that his circumstances required him to take. The philosophical complexity of this calculation, the way that his desperation and the Wayne family's vulnerability were both products of the same broken social order that Thomas Wayne's philanthropic efforts were, attempting to address, would become one of the recurring ironies of the story that followed. Though it was not available to the 8-year-old boy who watched his father try to shield his family and fail, Thomas Wayne's final act is the piece of this night that lodged most deeply in the specific architecture of his son's subsequent psychology. The instinct to step between his family and the gun was not heroism in any planned or considered sense. It was the automatic response of a father, the specific, biological, and emotional reflex that places the body between the vulnerable and the threat without consulting reason or calculating odds. It failed. The failure was total and instantaneous, but the gesture was witnessed by the child standing behind it, and the child's mind, in the specific way that traumatized minds process information, did not record it as a failed act. It recorded it as a template, as the shape that love took when love was expressed in the only language that the darkness understood. The father had stepped forward. The father had been insufficient. The conclusion the child's mind drew from this was not that the gesture was futile, but that the person making the gesture had been inadequate to the task, that the gesture itself was correct, and that what was needed was someone who could make it effectively. Martha Wayne's death cry and the scattered pearls that followed it completed the psychological encoding of the night in a way that no therapist would later be able to fully address. The pearls became the specific image that the child's mind returned to across years and decades, not the blood, not the gun, not even the face of the man who had done this, but the pearls catching the alley's ambient light as they scattered across the grimy pavement. The specific way that something beautiful and ordered and associated with his mother had been made suddenly chaotic and beyond recovery. Beauty destroyed by violence, order dissolved by the failure of protection, The child's mind filed this image alongside Thomas Wayne's forward gesture and Joe Chill's departing words, and began, in the specific way that a child's mind processes unbearable things, to construct from these materials a framework for understanding what the world was and what response it required. Joe Chill's words, as he turned away from the cowering child, the warning about what happened to people who tried to be heroes, were intended as a lesson in powerlessness, a demonstration that good intentions were no match for the ruthless pragmatism of someone willing to act outside the constraints that good intentions imposed. They were received as something entirely different. The specific quality of Bruce Wayne's psychology, the specific combination of intelligence, emotional intensity, and the particular form of rigidity that trauma can produce in certain kinds of minds, processed Chill's lesson not as a prohibition, but as a challenge. Not, do not try to be a hero, because heroes fail, but rather, find a form of heroism that cannot be defeated by the things that defeated your father. The words that were designed to close a door, instead, opened one. And the door that opened led into decades of obsessive preparation for a mission whose parameters the 8-year-old who set them could not have fully understood. The years that followed the murders are the years that most people know only in outline: the training, the traveling, the systematic acquisition of every capability that the mission would require. But the psychological reality of those years is more interesting and more disturbing than the outline suggests. Because what Bruce Wayne was doing in those years was not simply developing skills, he was dismantling a self. The ordinary machinery of adolescent and young adult psychological development, the formation of identity through relationships, the gradual negotiation of one's own values against the values of peers and mentors, the specific process by which a person discovers what they actually care about, through the friction of living alongside other people who care about different things, was being systematically bypassed in favor of a different process. Entirely, every emotional vulnerability was identified and suppressed. Every attachment that might one day be used against him was either severed or subordinated to the mission. Every aspect of his personality that did not serve the specific purpose he had given his life to was treated as weakness, to be eliminated rather than complexity to be developed. The journey to train under Master Kirigi in the secret Korean castle represented the furthest point of this process, the moment when Bruce Wayne was furthest from anything that might have returned him to ordinary human life, the moment when the exile that began in Crime Alley became most nearly absolute. The castle was not simply geographically remote. It was psychologically remote, a place that existed outside the assumptions of the civilization that had produced Bruce Wayne and that offered instruction in methods that civilization's surface values would not permit. The ways of the Shadow Warrior that Kirigi taught were not simply combat techniques. They were a comprehensive philosophy of power, a way of understanding human psychology that had been refined across centuries of practical application, and that recognized fear as the most reliable instrument available to anyone who needed to shape the behavior of others without access to legitimate authority. Bruce did not go to this place to become a better person. He went to become a more effective instrument, and he succeeded so thoroughly that the question of whether he was still a person, in any ordinary sense of the word, became genuinely difficult to answer by the time he was done. The defeat of Lady Shiva, Kirigi's most accomplished student, marked the completion of this phase. Bruce's graduation from the role of the person to whom things were done into the role of the person who decided what would happen to others. It was a genuine achievement, perhaps the most impressive pure achievement of his extraordinary life. It was also the moment when the cost of the transformation became fully visible for the first time, though Bruce himself could not see it from inside the experience of having accomplished something he had set out to accomplish. The respect that his fellow students accorded him after that defeat was not the respect of people who admired him. It was the respect of people who had recognized that he was the most dangerous thing in the room and who were adjusting their behavior accordingly. There was no affection in it. There was no warmth. The relationships he had formed in that castle were not relationships in any sense that would be recognizable to the child who had once had parents, who had once been capable of the ordinary human transactions of trust and care and mutual vulnerability. They were tactical assessments of a threat. And what was most important about this, what would define everything that followed, was that Bruce did not experience this as a loss. He experienced it as a success. He had trained himself to be seen as a weapon rather than a person, and the training had worked exactly as intended. And the fact that the outcome was indistinguishable from a profound human incapacity was invisible to him, because the framework through which he evaluated outcomes had been built by the same process that produced the incapacity. He returned to Gotham carrying this, along with everything else his years of preparation had given him. He returned to a city that had continued its slow self-destruction in his absence, that had generated new forms of the old corruptions and new populations of the desperate and the predatory who inhabited the spaces that legitimate institutions had abandoned. He returned with the skills and the philosophy and the psychological architecture necessary to do what he had decided to do. He returned as something that had no precedent and no adequate name, not a soldier, because soldiers operated within institutional frameworks that imposed accountability, not a vigilante in the simple sense, because the scale and sophistication of what he was planning exceeded anything that word had previously described. He returned as Bruce Wayne and as Batman, simultaneously, two identities that shared a body and a backstory and almost nothing else. Two versions of the same person that would spend the next several decades in a relationship of increasingly unequal competition that could only end one way. What he did not carry back from those years was what he had left behind in them, the specific capacity for ordinary human vulnerability that would have allowed him to build relationships based on genuine mutual trust rather than tactical calculation. The ability to be wrong about something important without experiencing that wrongness as a fundamental threat to his sense of himself and his mission. The particular kind of humility that comes from having been genuinely dependent on other people and having allowed that dependence to be known. He had surgically removed these capacities because the mission required their removal, because the specific kind of effectiveness he was pursuing could not survive them. The removal had worked, the capacities were gone, and the absence of these things in the years ahead would shape every relationship he attempted, and every institution he created, and every enemy he made, and every ally he damaged, in ways that would accumulate slowly, across decades, into something that deserved a name more honest than victory. The wound from Crime Alley had not healed. It had organized. It had taken the raw material of grief and powerlessness and the specific humiliation of watching a good man step forward and fail, and it had constructed from those materials a personality whose entire architecture was a response to that original rupture. The response was brilliant. It was fearless. It was, by any external measure, extraordinarily effective. But the wound was still there, at the foundation of everything he had built, invisible beneath the layers of training and preparation, and the mythology that the city would eventually construct around what he had become. It was patient in the way that wounds are patient when they have been incorporated into the structure of a life rather than addressed. It would wait as long as necessary. It had all the time in the world. The cave existed before Batman did. This is worth noting, worth sitting with for a moment, before moving on to everything that followed, because it tells something important about the relationship between the place and the person, about which one shaped the other and in what direction. The cave beneath Wayne Manor had been there for generations, a natural formation that the Wayne family had inhabited the land above without fully accounting for, a subterranean reality that the surface structure of their lives had rested upon without acknowledging. When Bruce Wayne descended into it and decided that it would become the center of his operation, he was not simply choosing a convenient location. He was choosing a metaphor that he would spend the rest of his life living inside the decision to place the truest version of himself beneath the foundations, to conduct his real work in the underground space that no one with legitimate access to his surface life would ever reach. The construction of the Batcave was the construction of a psychology made physical. Everything that Bruce Wayne was becoming in those years had a spatial equivalent in the cave. The forensic laboratory, where evidence was processed without legal oversight, corresponded to his willingness to pursue knowledge through means that institutional constraints would have prevented. The training equipment where his body was maintained at the precise edge of human physical capability corresponded to the specific form of self-discipline that treated the body as an instrument to be optimized rather than a self to be inhabited. The computer systems that gradually expanded to encompass more and more of Gotham's data landscape corresponded to the growing conviction that sufficient information, properly analyzed, could substitute for the kind of relational understanding of human beings that requires genuine trust and genuine vulnerability to develop. The cave was not a lair, it was an externalized self-portrait, and it became more accurate as the years passed, and both Bruce and the cave grew into each other's requirements. The specific location, literally beneath the foundations of Wayne Manor, beneath the surface establishment of one of Gotham's most prominent families, beneath the facade of the playboy billionaire whose public life was conducted with such deliberate and theatrical excess, established the essential structural logic of the double life in physical terms. Everything real was underground. Everything visible was performance. The distance between the two was not simply the practical distance of operational security. It was a psychological distance of enormous significance. The distance between who Bruce Wayne was willing to let the world see and who he actually was in the hours when no one was watching. Most people maintain some version of this gap. Bruce Wayne's version was not a gap. It was an abyss. And the abyss was not a regrettable necessity of his situation, but a fundamental feature of his psychology, something he had cultivated as deliberately as any of his combat skills, because the abyss was one of his most effective weapons. People who did not know what was beneath the surface could not threaten it. The cave was proof that the strategy worked, and the strategy's continued effectiveness was proof that the cave was necessary. And this circularity was one of the many feedback loops that Bruce would spend his career unable to examine, because examining it would have required standing outside a system that he was entirely inside. Alfred Pennyworth's decision to become the Batcave's only full-time occupant, to serve as medical officer and tactical support and emotional anchor, and the single human being who knew the complete picture, was not a simple decision, and it deserves more than the simplified loyalty narrative that the surface version of his relationship with Bruce typically receives. Alfred was not naive. His military background and his medical training gave him the specific combination of knowledge that would allow him to understand, in technical terms, exactly what kind of creature he was helping to build. He understood trauma and its effects on personality. He understood the specific psychological profiles of people who sought violence as a vocation. He understood the specific physiological and psychological costs of the lifestyle that Bruce was constructing. He understood all of this clearly and professionally, and with the specific detachment that medical training provides, and he made his choice anyway, because the child who had lost his parents was still inside the man who was becoming Batman, and the love Alfred bore for that child was not a feeling he had any mechanism for overriding, regardless of what the professional detachment might have concluded about the wisdom of the choice. This is the moral complexity that the surface narrative of Alfred's loyalty consistently obscures. He was not simply a devoted servant enabling a hero. He was a person who had examined the available evidence and made a conscious decision to prioritize his love for a specific individual over the broader implications of what enabling that individual would produce. The monster that Bruce was becoming was not invisible to Alfred. It was visible in precise clinical detail, and Alfred catalogued its features with the same thoroughness he brought to cataloging Bruce's injuries after patrol. He saw the narrowing of emotional range, the progressive replacement of genuine human response with tactical calculation. The way that each year brought Bruce slightly further from the person he had been and slightly closer to the thing he was trying to become. He saw it and he stayed, because staying was what love required. Because the alternative was leaving the person he loved entirely, without anchor, in a situation where the absence of any anchor at all might produce something significantly worse than the compromised version that Alfred's presence was, helping to sustain. The specific functions Alfred performed in the cave were inseparable from the functions he performed in Bruce's psychology. He sutured the wounds that the mission produced with the same practiced hands that prepared the meals that kept the mission viable. He maintained the equipment that Bruce depended on while simultaneously maintaining the fiction to the outside world that Wayne Manor was occupied only by a wealthy, eccentric, and his devoted butler. He provided the intelligence assessments and the logistical support and the dry commentary on Bruce's tactical decisions that constituted the closest thing to honest feedback that Bruce ever received, closer, certainly, than anything the city's criminals could offer, and infinitely closer than anything the carefully maintained surface persona of Bruce Wayne was ever required to engage with. Alfred was the one person for whom Bruce did not perform. The relationship between them was the one relationship in his life that was not entirely tactical. It was also, perhaps not coincidentally, the relationship whose loss would prove most devastating when the time came. The relationship that Bruce had unconsciously built his entire psychological infrastructure around, without ever fully acknowledging how fundamental its continued existence was to his ability to function. The playboy billionaire who existed on the surface of Bruce Wayne's life was not, as it is sometimes described, simply a disguise, a false face worn over the true face to deflect suspicion. The reality was considerably more psychologically interesting and considerably more troubling. Bruce Wayne, the public figure, was a pressure valve, a mechanism for releasing the specific kind of social and emotional pressure that the cave could not contain. The extravagant parties, the conspicuous consumption, the series of relationships conducted with carefully maintained emotional shallowness, these were not performances of indifference. They were performances of a kind of freedom, a kind of ordinary human pleasure in ordinary human things that Batman could not permit and that Bruce could not entirely suppress. The playboy was the part of him that had not been fully converted to the mission's requirements, the residual humanity that the training had not entirely eliminated, given a form and a name and a public persona, precisely because the alternative, allowing that residual humanity to exist without a container, was too dangerous. If it was not channeled into the performance of the billionaire's life, it might find its way into Batman's operations. And humanity, in Batman's operations, was a vulnerability. The first encounters with Gotham's criminal underworld demonstrated something that Bruce had theorized, but not yet confirmed that the specific approach he had developed worked. That fear applied with sufficient sophistication and sufficient information was more effective as a crime-fighting tool than anything that operated within the constraints of legitimate law enforcement. The criminals he encountered understood the logic of fear instinctively, because it was the logic that governed their own operations. They had no framework for engaging with an adversary who used their own methods against them, who understood their psychology as well as they understood each other's, who was willing to inhabit the same moral space they inhabited without the institutional constraints that had always protected them from legitimate opposition. Batman's methods worked because they operated according to principles that criminals recognized as genuinely threatening in a way that legal procedures simply were not. The discovery was intoxicating in a specific way that Bruce did not fully account for. It confirmed the mission. It validated the years of preparation. It demonstrated that the specific sacrifices made in service of becoming what he had become were not futile, but necessary and sufficient. But it also established a precedent that would govern his relationship to the question of methods for the rest of his career. the precedent that effectiveness was the primary criterion, that methods which worked were by definition the right methods, that the question of what the methods produced beyond their immediate tactical results was a question that could be deferred indefinitely in favor of the urgent operational requirements of the moment. He had discovered that fear worked. He would spend the next several decades following that discovery toward its logical conclusions, and the logical conclusions would eventually produce something that the 8-year-old in the alley could not have recognized as the heroism he had set out to achieve. The cave grew with him. As his operation expanded, as his understanding of Gotham's criminal landscape deepened, as his need for information and analytical capability increased, the physical space beneath Wayne Manor expanded to accommodate the requirements. The computer systems became more sophisticated, encompassing more and more of the city's data in their analytical reach. The medical bay became more comprehensive, capable of addressing the increasingly serious injuries that years of combat produced in a body that was aging, even as it was being maintained at extraordinary levels of physical capability. The records of his cases accumulated in the cave's archives, the most comprehensive criminal intelligence database in Gotham, assembled through methods that no legitimate authority could have employed, curated by a mind that had dedicated itself entirely to understanding how the city's darkness organized itself and what pressure points would produce the outcomes the mission required. What the cave could not accommodate was the specific thing that Alfred's presence was trying to preserve: the memory of what Bruce had been before the cave, the ghost of the person who had descended into it with a wound and had built, from the wound's requirements, an infrastructure that was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely monstrous simultaneously. The cave was the monument to the mission. Alfred was the monument to the person. The tension between them was the tension at the center of everything that followed, the tension that the Batcave's expanding sophistication and increasing capability could never resolve, because the question it was unable to answer was not a question about capability at all. It was a question about what the capability was, for not in the tactical sense, which Bruce could answer with precision and exhaustive detail, but in the deeper sense, the sense that asks not what a person is doing, but who they are doing it for, and whether the person they are doing it for still exists in any meaningful form inside the architecture that has been built in their name. The cave was finished in one sense from the beginning, and unfinished in another sense that could never be resolved, because what it was building toward the complete realization of Batman as a force sufficient to hold Gotham's darkness in check was not a destination that could be reached. It was a horizon, and horizons recede as you approach them, and the cave grew to accommodate the distance remaining, not by diminishing but by expanding, because expansion was the only response available to a system that had been designed around a mission whose completion was structurally impossible. The man at the center of it moved further underground with each year, further from the surface life, further from the residual humanity that Alfred was trying to preserve, further from the wound that had started everything, which was not healing but was being built around, one layer at a time, until the structure erected around it was vast enough that the wound itself had become invisible, present at the foundation of everything, fundamental to the shape of everything, and entirely impossible to see from any position inside the edifice it had produced. Jim Gordon was not a corrupt man. This is the first and most important thing to establish about him, because the story of what his association with Batman produced cannot be properly understood without the foundation of what he was before that association began, what principles he carried into Gotham's police department, what he was willing to sacrifice and what he was not, what lines he had drawn for himself across years of service in a city that offered its law enforcement officers constant and sophisticated incentives to redraw those lines in more convenient locations. Gordon was the specific kind of principled person that genuinely corrupt institutions find most threatening and most useful, simultaneously threatening because his refusal to participate in the department's systemic compromises made those compromises visible by contrast, useful because his reputation for integrity provided cover for an institution that desperately needed cover, a human shield of demonstrated personal virtue behind which a great deal of institutional vice could conduct itself without attracting the scrutiny it deserved. He had come to understand, over years of watching Gotham's criminal justice system operate, that conventional approaches to law enforcement were inadequate to the specific nature of the city's problems. This understanding was not cynicism. It was the specific form of clear-eyed realism that belongs to people who have genuinely tried to work within systems and have genuinely observed the limits of those systems without allowing that observation to become an excuse for abandoning the systems entirely. Gordon believed in the law. He believed in due process. He believed that the protections afforded to accused criminals by the constitutional framework were not obstacles to justice, but the precise definition of it. That a justice system that abandoned its own principles in pursuit of outcomes was no longer a justice system in any meaningful sense, regardless of what it called itself. These beliefs were not abstractions to him. They were the specific daily commitments that governed how he conducted investigations, gathered evidence, managed his officers, and presented cases to prosecutors who would need to stand behind them in court. Batman arrived in his life as the specific kind of problem that Gordon's principles were not equipped to solve. The vigilante's methods worked. This was the fact that could not be argued around, the operational reality that made every principled objection to the partnership feel, in the moment, like a luxury that Gotham's citizens could not afford. The criminals that Batman apprehended were genuinely dangerous. The intelligence that Batman gathered was genuinely accurate. The outcomes that Batman produced, the arrests, the disrupted operations, the specific reduction in certain categories of violent crime that accompanied his presence in the city were genuinely preferable to the outcomes that Gordon's department had been producing through conventional means in the years before Batman appeared. Gordon could observe all of this clearly and simultaneously observe that the methods producing these outcomes were illegal, that the evidence produced by those methods was frequently inadmissible, that the department's tacit acceptance of Batman's existence was creating institutional precedents whose long-term implications were far more damaging than the short-term benefits appeared to justify. The first compromise was the smallest. It was also, in retrospect, the most significant, not because of what it permitted, but because of what it established. Gordon chose, in a specific situation, whose operational pressures made the choice feel reasonable and temporary, to overlook something that his principles required him to address. He told himself that the choice was context-specific, that the unusual circumstances justified an unusual response, that the principle he was setting aside was not being abandoned, but merely suspended for the duration of an emergency that would eventually pass. This is the specific form that the corruption of principled people always takes, not the sudden abandonment of principles under pressure, which most principled people can resist, but the gradual accumulation of individually justifiable exceptions that collectively constitute the abandonment of the principle, without any single moment when the abandonment is clearly visible and therefore clearly resistible. Batman understood this mechanism, whether consciously or not. His entire approach to the Gordon relationship was predicated on a sophisticated understanding of how to move principled people incrementally toward positions they would have rejected if those positions had been presented directly at the beginning of the relationship. He did not ask Gordon to abandon his principles. He asked him to make a series of reasonable accommodations, each of which was genuinely reasonable in its immediate context, each of which produced genuinely beneficial, immediate results, each of which made the next accommodation slightly easier to accept because the previous ones had established that accommodation was acceptable and that the results justified it. Gordon was not deceived in any simple sense. He understood what was happening at some level of awareness throughout the process. What he could not do was find a specific moment when stopping was clearly the right choice, because each individual step had been small enough to rationalize, and the cumulative destination only became visible from a vantage point he was never able to reach because reaching it would have required him to stop moving in the direction he was moving. The specific psychological pressure of carrying the knowledge of the partnership was a weight that the surface narrative of Gordon's career consistently underestimates. He knew things about Batman's operations that he could not share with his officers, with the prosecutors whose cases depended on his integrity, with the oversight bodies responsible for monitoring the department's conduct, with his own family. The knowledge created a specific form of isolation, not the isolation of loneliness, which can be addressed through connection, but the isolation of complicity, which cannot be addressed without confession. And confession was not available to Gordon because the thing he would have needed to confess was not a contained incident, but the entire operational framework of his most significant professional relationship. He carried this in the specific silence that operational security required, and the carrying of it changed him in ways that were not dramatic but were continuous. The way that carrying a weight that slightly exceeds your comfortable capacity changes your posture and your gait across years of daily effort, until the change has become so gradual and so thorough that neither you nor the people around you can clearly remember what you looked like before you were carrying it. The attacks on Barbara were the specific form of payment that the partnership extracted from Gordon's family. She had not chosen Batman's war. She had chosen her own version of the same impulse that had driven her father into his uncomfortable alliance, the desire to be effective against the specific forms of injustice that Gotham produced, the recognition that the legitimate channels available to her were inadequate to the scale of the problem, the decision to act outside those channels because the alternative was inaction, and inaction was not something she could accept. But the Joker did not target Barbara because of her own choices. He targeted her because of her father's. She became a weapon against Gordon, and Gordon became a weapon against Batman, through the specific logic of targeting that Batman's extra-legal methods had made available to his enemies, the logic that said anyone connected to the man constituted a potential vulnerability, that the people he cared about could be used as instruments of pressure, because caring constituted a structural weakness in his operational architecture. Barbara paid the price for a relationship she had not chosen. Gordon paid it alongside her, in a different currency, across a longer timeline, with the specific quality of guilt that belongs to people who understand that they bear some portion of responsibility for a harm they did not intend and could not have fully anticipated, but that was nonetheless produced in part by their choices. The relationship between Gordon and Batman was, at its most fundamental level, a relationship between two men who shared a genuine commitment to protecting Gotham and who had developed incompatible theories about how that protection should be pursued. Gordon's theory was institutional, the belief that the legitimacy of the methods was inseparable from the legitimacy of the outcomes, that a justice produced through unjust means was not justice but something else wearing justice's name. Batman's theory was consequentialist in the specific way that consequentialism always operates in the minds of people who are deeply convinced of the righteousness of their cause outcomes justified methods. And the specific outcomes Batman was pursuing were important enough to justify methods that Gordon's institutional framework could not accommodate. Neither of these theories was entirely wrong. The tragedy of the relationship was not that one of the men was right and the other was wrong, but that both of them were right about something real, and that the thing each was right about was genuinely incompatible with the thing the other was right about, and that neither of them had the distance from his own commitments to see this incompatibility clearly. What the relationship produced across the years of its operation was the gradual transformation of Gordon from the specific kind of principled law enforcement officer he had been at the beginning into something more complex and more compromised, not corrupt in the simple sense, not serving his own interests at the expense of the public's, but complicit in a system that operated outside the legal and ethical frameworks that the public had a right to expect would govern the people entrusted with their protection. He had become an enabler of vigilantism, a legitimizing presence whose reputation for integrity provided cover for activities that would not have survived examination by any standard he had once held himself to. He had done this one reasonable step at a time, driven by genuine commitment to outcomes he genuinely valued, and the cumulative result was a career that could not be fully defended by the principles that had defined it at its beginning. The specific form of this corruption, the corruption of the principled person who made too many individually justifiable exceptions, was in some ways more troubling than the corruption of people who had never had principles to begin with, because it demonstrated that the principles had not been sufficient protection, that the combination of genuine commitment to good outcomes and sufficient operational pressure could produce the same destination as the absence of commitment, just via a longer and more painful route. Gordon knew this, at the level of awareness that does not announce itself, but that shapes the quality of a person's sleep and the specific cast of their reflections in the early hours of the morning. He knew it, and he continued, because the alternative withdrawing from the partnership, refusing the operational benefits it provided, enforcing the legal and ethical standards that his position required, felt, from inside the situation, like choosing principle over people, like allowing Gotham's citizens to pay the price of his integrity. This is the specific trap that Batman set for him, not deliberately but structurally, not through malice, but through the logic of a method that required complicity to function and that produced genuine results that made complicity feel obligatory. Gordon was caught in it and could not get free, and the city he had dedicated his life to protecting would spend years benefiting from his captivity without ever fully understanding what his captivity had cost him or what it had made him. Amadeus Arkham did not build a prison. This distinction matters. It matters in the way that the distance between what something is intended to be and what it becomes always matters, because the distance tells you something about the forces that shaped the transformation, about what the world did to the intention, and why the intention was insufficient protection against what the world required. Arkham built a sanctuary. He built a place grounded in the genuine humanitarian conviction that the people, society called criminally insane, were not monsters to be contained, but human beings whose minds had been fractured by circumstances that compassionate treatment and scientific understanding might address, whose suffering was not a fixed feature of their nature, but a condition that the right environment and the right therapeutic relationship might ameliorate. His architectural choices expressed this conviction directly. The spacious common areas, the individual rooms designed to preserve dignity, the extensive grounds where patients might experience the restorative contact with the natural world that institutional confinement typically denied. The Gothic revival structures were meant to evoke sanctuary and peace, the grandeur of places where troubled souls had historically found refuge. He was building what he believed the world required. He had no mechanism for anticipating what the world would do with what he built. The asylum's early years contained genuine victories, and this is important to acknowledge rather than collapse into the simpler narrative of inevitable corruption. Patients improved. Families were reunited with people they had feared lost. The innovative therapeutic approaches that Arkham championed produced results that attracted serious medical minds who believed they were participating in work that would advance human understanding of the mind's most intractable conditions. The institution functioned, for a period, as its founder intended as a place of healing rather than mere containment, as evidence that the most damaged minds could be reached by the right combination of compassion and expertise. These early successes were real, and their reality makes the trajectory that followed more disturbing rather than less, because the corruption that eventually consumed the institution was not the corruption of something that had always been rotten, but the corruption of something that had genuinely been good, something whose goodness had been real enough to attract people who wanted to do good work, and whose deterioration was, therefore, a genuine moral catastrophe rather than the simple exposure of a pretense. The first compromises were institutional rather than personal, decisions made at the administrative level that seemed individually reasonable, but that collectively shifted the asylum's operational logic in ways that would prove irreversible. The decision to accept patients whose conditions exceeded the staff's capacity to treat was justified as mercy, as the provision of care to people whom other institutions had abandoned. It was also the decision that introduced into the patient population a permanent subset for whom the therapeutic mission was structurally inapplicable, people who were not going to improve, who would remain indefinitely, whose presence gradually shifted the institution's practical focus from rehabilitation to long-term management. The introduction of experimental treatments without adequate oversight was presented as necessary innovation, as the appropriate response to conditions that established therapeutic protocols had been unable to address. It was also the normalization of the use of patients as research subjects, the first step in a long process of reconceiving the therapeutic relationship as something other than the relationship between a healer and a person seeking healing. The physical deterioration of the buildings paralleled the moral deterioration of the institution's mission, with a precision that was not metaphorical but structural. The same budgetary pressures, the same administrative priorities, the same organizational culture that permitted the ethical erosion also permitted the deferred maintenance and the inadequate staffing and the creeping institutional indifference to the welfare of the people within the walls. The elegant Gothic architecture that Amadeus Arkham had designed to inspire hope became something different as the years passed, not suddenly, not through any single dramatic transformation, but through the gradual accumulation of disrepair and neglect that transformed intended grandeur into actual dread, that converted the visual language of sanctuary into the visual language of imprisonment without any deliberate decision to make that conversion. The crumbling masonry and the rusted fixtures and the leaking pipes were not incidental. They were the visible expression of an institution that had stopped believing in the thing it was ostensibly built for, whose physical fabric was deteriorating because the people responsible for it had ceased to care about what the deterioration communicated to the people forced to live within it. Amadeus Arkham's own descent into the condition he had built his life's work to address was the most concentrated expression of what the asylum was becoming, a microcosm of the broader institutional corruption. One man's specific psychological disintegration functioning as a preview of the collective disintegration that would follow. His decision to treat Martin Hawkins, the serial killer who had murdered his wife and daughter, was the moment when the therapeutic mission became something else, when the professional relationship between healer and patient became contaminated by the specific quality of personal investment that the therapeutic relationship cannot survive. He was not simply treating a patient. He was engaging, through the clinical framework of therapy, with the specific person responsible for the most devastating losses of his life, conducting a process that was nominally organized around Hawkins's recovery, but that was actually organized around something far more personal and far less professionally sustainable. The sessions eroded Arkham's sanity, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the simple psychological reality that extended close contact with the specific form of evil that had destroyed everything you loved produces. Effects that professional training is not designed to prevent. He had built a sanctuary for damaged minds, and his own mind had been destroyed by the sanctuary's most dangerous occupant. And the irony of this was not lost on the institution that bore his name, which would spend its subsequent history producing similar outcomes at industrial scale. What Batman required this institution to become is the question that the asylum's history consistently raises, and that the asylum's official narrative consistently declines to answer. Because Batman did not build Arkham Asylum. He did not design it, fund it, or administer it. His relationship to the institution was entirely indirect. He apprehended the people who were sent there, contributed to the population that its walls contained, and relied on its continued operation as the mechanism through which Gotham processed the specific category of threat that his methods produced. But the institution's trajectory across the years of his operation followed the specific logic of his approach to crime fighting so precisely that the question of causation cannot be dismissed. Batman's method required a destination for the people he caught that was not prison, because the people he caught were increasingly operating at levels of psychological complexity and tactical sophistication that made ordinary imprisonment both inadequate as a security measure and insufficient as a response to what they actually were. Arkham Asylum was that destination, the specific place that his specific approach to crime fighting created the specific need for. What the place became was shaped in no small part by what he required it to do. The people Batman sent to Arkham were not ordinary criminals. They were the products of his specific operational environment, individuals whose confrontations with the particular psychological warfare that Batman deployed, whose exposure to the specific form of fear-based engagement that his method employed, had in many cases deepened and elaborated rather than resolved the psychological conditions that had made them dangerous in the first place. The asylum received them and was required to do something with them and what it was structurally capable of doing with them, given its patient population, its staffing, its funding. Its institutional culture was not rehabilitation, but containment, not treatment, but management, not the healing of damaged minds, but the warehousing of dangerous ones in conditions that regularly made the conditions worse. The revolving door that developed between Arkham and Gotham streets was not a failure of the institution in any simple sense. It was the institution functioning as the system that surrounded it, required it to function, providing the temporary removal of threats that Batman's approach produced, without the permanent resolution of those threats that genuine treatment might have offered, because permanent resolution would have required resources and institutional commitment and a therapeutic philosophy that the reality of the asylum's operation had long since made impossible. The hiring practices that evolved as the institution's culture deteriorated told their own story about what the asylum had become and what it understood itself to be. Qualified professionals who arrived with genuine therapeutic commitments found themselves working within a culture that normalized practices they had been trained to recognize as violations, the use of experimental treatments without adequate, informed consent, the employment of physical restraints as punitive rather than protective measures, the systematic falsification of records to protect the institution from the external scrutiny that accurate records would have attracted. Some left. Others stayed and were gradually corrupted by the specific mechanism through which institutions corrupt the individuals within them, not through any single dramatic moment of moral failure, but through the accumulation of daily small compliances with practices they had not endorsed but had not refused, until the compliances had become habits, and the habits had become identity, and the identity had become indistinguishable from the institution itself. The guards who became tormentors, and the orderlies who became dealers in contraband, and the medical staff who became complicit in systematic abuse were not exceptional people who had harbored these tendencies before arriving. They were ordinary people who had been produced by an institution that selected for and rewarded the specific qualities that institutional abuse requires: indifference to the welfare of those in your care, willingness to prioritize institutional interests over individual ones, facility with the documentation practices that create the appearance of compliance while concealing its reality. The patient population itself completed the transformation. As word spread through Gotham's criminal networks that Arkham was a place where the rules of civilized society no longer applied, where the specific combination of inadequate oversight and institutional corruption had created an environment that certain categories of criminal found preferable to conventional imprisonment, the population shifted in ways that made the therapeutic mission structurally untenable. People who had never had a legitimate psychiatric condition and who had no intention of acquiring one found their way into Arkham's population through the specific mechanisms of legal and administrative manipulation that the line as mass institutions compromised admission processes made available. They arrived with no need of healing and no expectation of receiving it, with the specific expertise in manipulation and psychological predation that their criminal histories had developed. And they occupied space alongside people whose genuine psychiatric conditions the institution had already been failing to treat. The mixing was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of everything. The institution had become the natural destination of a process that had been running one small step at a time. Since the first administrative compromise had established that the therapeutic mission was negotiable when institutional interests required it to be, Quincy Sharp's ascent to the superintendency was not the cause of the asylum's corruption, but its most articulate expression, the moment when the institution's actual operational priorities were fully embodied in the person nominally responsible for its administration. Sharp did not corrupt Arkham. He was produced by it, elevated by a system that rewarded the specific combination of political ambition, administrative efficiency, and ethical flexibility that his approach to the position represented. His transformation of the asylum from a nominal medical facility into a de facto prison was not a betrayal of the institution's mission. It was the honest expression of what the mission had actually become across the decades of its deterioration, the containment of people society had designated as dangerous, the management of liability, the generation of the documentation that would protect the institution from external scrutiny while providing no meaningful guidance about what was actually occurring within the walls. The therapeutic programs that continued under Sharp's administration were maintained for their public relations value, because the public relations value was real and the therapeutic value had largely ceased to be. The appearance of healing was the only form of healing the institution still provided, and even that appearance became increasingly difficult to maintain, as the distance between the institution's stated purpose and its actual operation grew too large for the documentation to bridge. What Batman created in this accounting was not a villain. He created a condition, the specific condition under which an institution designed for one purpose becomes structurally required to serve an entirely different one, and in which the requirements of that different purpose gradually consume the original one without any single moment of decisive abandonment. He did not intend this. The space between intention and outcome is one of the most consistent features of his story, and nowhere is that space more clearly visible than in the relationship between what he required Arkham to be and what Arkham became. He required a place where Gotham's most dangerous minds could be sent after he had finished with them. What developed in that place across the years of his operation was a factory for producing more dangerous minds, a recycling system that received the products of his specific approach to crime fighting and returned them to the street in worse condition than they had arrived, more sophisticated in their methods, more deeply committed to their particular forms of chaos, more thoroughly shaped by the specific institution that was nominally designed to address their conditions. The asylum that Amadeus Arkham built to heal the world's wounded minds became, under the specific pressures that Batman's presence in Gotham created and sustained, one of the primary mechanisms through which the wounding continued. And Batman, who was many extraordinary things, was never able to see this clearly enough, or for long enough to ask the question that seeing it clearly would have required him to ask the question of what his methods were actually building, and whether what they were building was what he had come to Gotham to build. Hugo Strange began as a healer. This is the fact that the later chapters of his story consistently obscure the fact that the extraordinary intelligence and the genuine psychological insight that he would eventually direct toward manipulation and domination had been developed in service of a different and more admirable purpose, that the skills which made him so effective as an instrument of control had been honed through years of legitimate therapeutic work in which he had genuinely helped people whose suffering was real, and whose recovery was real, and whose gratitude was genuine. The transformation that produced the figure who would eventually construct Arkham City as a laboratory for studying human behavior under extreme conditions was not the emergence of something that had always been latent and waiting. It was the corruption of something that had once been good, the specific process by which genuine capability in service of genuine care becomes, through stages of moral compromise that feel individually reasonable and collectively constitute a catastrophe, the most sophisticated instrument of exactly the harm it was originally designed to address. His early career was marked by achievements that his peers recognized and that his patients experienced as the specific relief that comes when someone who genuinely understands your suffering applies genuine skill to its treatment. Strange was not a fraudulent clinician who had always been concealing a predator behind a therapeutic mask. He was a clinician of real ability and real commitment, whose trajectory away from those qualities was shaped by the specific combination of intelligence, ambition, and the particular form of fascination that close contact with extreme psychology produces in certain kinds of minds. The fascination began as professional interest, the appropriate orientation of a serious researcher toward the phenomena his work regularly presented him with. It became something else gradually, as professional interest always becomes something else when the boundary between studying a subject and being captivated by it erodes, when the clinical distance that protects both the practitioner and the patient from the dynamics that therapeutic proximity can produce is gradually replaced by engagement, investment, the specific quality of personal stake in the subject that the professional distance was designed to prevent. What Strange found as his clinical career progressed was that his understanding of human psychology was not simply a tool for helping his patients recover from the conditions that had brought them to him. It was a tool for understanding exactly how human beings could be influenced, directed, and controlled, how the specific vulnerabilities that manifested as psychiatric conditions in the people seeking his help were simply more visible versions of vulnerabilities that existed in every human being, vulnerabilities that a sufficiently sophisticated practitioner could identify and exploit with a precision that conventional methods of coercion and manipulation could not approach. This recognition was not a sudden revelation. It arrived gradually, the way that certain kinds of understanding arrive through the accumulation of clinical observations that each seemed individually unremarkable, but that collectively constituted a theory about the relationship between knowledge of human psychology and power over human behavior, that Strange became increasingly unwilling to leave as a theory rather than pursuing as a practice. The specific mechanism of his moral transition was the redefinition of his patients. For as long as he understood them as people, as subjects with their own intrinsic value, their own purposes, their own legitimate claims on his professional commitment to their welfare, the therapeutic framework held. The moment he began to understand them as data, as sources of information about the mechanisms of human psychological vulnerability that were valuable primarily for what they revealed about those mechanisms rather than for their own sake, the therapeutic framework became vestigial, a historical residue of an orientation he had moved past, maintained because the institutional context required its maintenance rather than because it reflected his actual relationship to the work. His patients did not become less useful to him when he made this transition. They became more useful, more precisely useful, more efficiently exploited. Their suffering converted from a condition requiring treatment to a condition generating data that could be systematically organized and applied to purposes that had nothing to do with their recovery and everything to do with Strange's growing conviction that the understanding he was developing constituted a form of power that he was uniquely positioned to exercise. The institutional authority that his credentials provided was the specific mechanism that allowed this transition to proceed without the external scrutiny that might have interrupted it. Society's trust in medical and psychological professionals is a form of structural vulnerability, the reasonable decision to grant significant authority over vulnerable populations to people whose training is assumed to orient. That authority toward the welfare of those populations, rather than toward the practitioner's own interests. Strange exploited this vulnerability not through any crude deception, but through the sophisticated deployment of the appearance of legitimate practice, the maintenance of documentation, the performance of therapeutic protocols, the careful management of the external presentation of his work in ways that satisfied oversight processes designed to detect obvious abuse rather than sophisticated concealment. The trust that society placed in the therapeutic relationship created around his activities a protective barrier that made what he was doing genuinely difficult to see from outside, because the framework for understanding what he was doing was designed around the assumption that what he was doing was therapy, and therapy is not what he was doing. His discovery of Batman's secret identity was the moment that redirected the trajectory of his career toward its eventual destination. The discovery itself was a professional achievement, the application of his theoretical framework about the relationship between trauma, identity, and behavioral patterns to a specific subject whose psychological profile presented exactly the kind of extreme case that his theory predicted would be most legible to someone with sufficient analytical sophistication. Bruce Wayne was, from Strange's perspective, the ideal subject, someone whose foundational trauma was sufficiently extreme and sufficiently well documented to allow precise analysis, whose subsequent behavioral choices were sufficiently distinctive to constitute a signature that pointed unambiguously to the wound at the center of them, whose operational methods were sufficiently consistent to allow reverse engineering of the psychological architecture that had produced them. The identification of Batman as Bruce Wayne was, for Strange, less a discovery than a confirmation, the empirical validation of a theoretical framework that his years of clinical and research work had been developing. Proof that his model of the relationship between trauma and identity was accurate in precisely the way he had believed it to be. What the discovery gave him practically was leverage of a kind that his previous work had not provided, not the diffuse leverage of institutional authority over vulnerable patients, but specific personal leverage over a specific individual whose psychological profile he understood better than anyone else alive, and whose operational exposure to that leverage was therefore precisely predictable. The knowledge of Batman's identity was not simply information. It was the master key to every vulnerability that Bruce Wayne possessed, every attachment, every fear, every specific form of psychological pressure that the analysis of his profile had revealed as reliably effective. Strange now possessed not just the theoretical understanding of how human beings could be controlled, but the specific targeting data required to apply that understanding to the most powerful and most psychologically defended individual in Gotham with maximum precision. The relationship between Strange and Batman was, in this light, the most precise mirror that the Arkham universe produced, not the philosophical mirror of the Joker, who represented the chaos that Batman's insistence on order was always implicitly in dialogue with, but a different kind of mirror, one that reflected not Batman's psychology in opposition, but Batman's methods in an advanced form. Strange did what Batman did. He gathered information about human vulnerability through means that legitimate frameworks would not have sanctioned. He used that information to influence and control the behavior of people who had not consented to be influenced or controlled by him. He operated from a position of asymmetric knowledge, understanding the people he engaged with far better than they understood themselves. And he leveraged that asymmetry with the specific coldness of someone who had thoroughly converted the people around him from subjects to objects. The primary difference between them was the stated purpose Batman told himself, and anyone who asked that his methods served the protection of the innocent, while Strange had dispensed with the stated purpose and operated in the honest acknowledgement that what he was actually interested in was the exercise of capability for its own sake. But the methods were the same methods. The logic was the same logic. The gap between them was not the gap between hero and villain, but the gap between a person who still maintained a story about why he was doing what he was doing, and a person who had dispensed with the story. The creation of Arkham City was the most complete expression of Strange's particular vision, the physical realization of what his years of clinical and theoretical work had been building toward, the construction of an environment in which his understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions could be applied at a scale that exceeded anything his previous institutional contexts had made possible. The project was presented to political authorities as an innovative approach to criminal rehabilitation and urban planning. The specific language of progressive social policy applied to a project whose actual purpose had nothing to do with rehabilitation and everything to do with research, with the generation of data about how human communities organized themselves under conditions of resource scarcity, surveillance, and carefully calibrated stress. The authorities who approved it were not deceived in the simple sense of having been lied to. They were manipulated in the more sophisticated sense of having been told true things in an arrangement that produced false understanding, given accurate information about the project's stated goals, and denied the framing that would have allowed them to understand what those goals were actually in service of. The protocols that governed life within Arkham City were the clinical protocols of Strange's theoretical framework implemented at urban scale. The careful calibration of environmental stresses, the systematic monitoring of behavioral responses, the manipulation of resource availability and social dynamics to produce the specific kinds of conflict and cooperation that would generate the data his research required. The apparent chaos that characterized the city's social structure was not a failure of administration, but a feature of the research design, the specific form of controlled disorder that Strange's experimental protocols required, maintained at the precise level of instability that would generate useful behavioral data without collapsing into the kind of total disintegration that would compromise the validity of the research. He was not managing a prison. He was running an experiment, and the subjects of the experiment were human beings who had been placed in his laboratory without their knowledge or consent, whose suffering was not a regrettable side effect of necessary containment, but a deliberate variable in a research protocol designed to advance his understanding of how human beings could be most efficiently controlled. The parallel between what Strange built in Arkham City and what Batman had been building across his entire career was not incidental. It was structural, the specific convergence of two approaches to the same fundamental project, the project of understanding human vulnerability well enough to direct human behavior toward desired outcomes, that had developed from different starting points and through different institutional contexts, but that had arrived at the same operational logic. Batman gathered intelligence about criminals to neutralize them. Strange gathered intelligence about human beings to control them. Batman used fear to shape the behavior of people who posed threats. Strange used environmental stress and carefully calibrated deprivation to shape the behavior of entire populations. Batman maintained a file on every significant criminal in Gotham, a comprehensive record of psychological vulnerabilities and behavioral patterns that could be exploited when operational requirements demanded it. Strange maintained a research database of the same kind, organized according to the same logic, serving the same fundamental purpose. Neither of them had arrived at this point through deliberate malice. Both of them had arrived at it through the specific trajectory that the pursuit of effective control follows when it is sustained across sufficient time by sufficient intelligence and sufficient commitment without adequate external accountability. Batman could not see this clearly. This was the specific limitation that his psychology imposed on his understanding of Strange, the limitation that prevented him from recognizing in Strange's methods a more advanced and more honest version of his own, that required him to understand Strange as a corrupt perversion of the therapeutic mission, rather than as a colleague in the same fundamental project, who had simply dispensed with the ethical restraints that Batman continued to maintain in diminishing form. The The story Batman told himself about the difference between them was a story he needed to believe, because the alternative, acknowledging that the difference was one of degree rather than kind, that the methods were the same methods and the logic was the same logic, and that the primary distinction was the presence or absence of a stated justification rather than any fundamental difference in the nature of the activity, would have required him to ask questions about his own operation that his psychology was not designed to permit. Strange understood this about Batman before Batman understood it about himself. The specific profile he had constructed of the Dark Knight included, as one of its most precisely mapped features, the exact location and nature of the blind spot that prevented self-examination, the wound from Crime Alley, and the entire edifice of conviction and purpose built around it that functioned simultaneously as Batman's greatest strength and as the most reliable protection against the kind of honest self-assessment that might have allowed him to see what he was becoming. Strange did not exploit this blind spot directly. He simply noted it, filed it in the comprehensive record he was building, and understood that the man who was Batman was, in the most important psychological respect, the most thoroughly managed subject in Gotham, managed not by Strange, but by the specific story Bruce Wayne had been telling himself since he was 8 years old. A story so thoroughly internalized and so completely structural to his sense of himself and his purpose that it had become invisible to him, the water he swam in, rather than a narrative he had chosen. Strange, who had built his career on understanding exactly this kind of invisible structuring, recognized it immediately and understood its implications with a precision that Batman never would. Jason Todd was not found. He was recognized. This distinction matters in the way that all distinctions between active and passive choice matter, when the consequences of the choice are as significant as these consequences prove to be. Because finding implies accident, implies the discovery of something that would not have been sought if the seeker had known what the finding would cost. While recognition implies something more deliberate and more revealing, a kind of seeing that reflects as much about the seer as about the thing seen. Bruce Wayne looked at the damaged and angry young person who would become the second Robin and recognized in him something specific, not simply potential, not simply the raw capability that training might convert into operational effectiveness, but a particular quality of wound that he understood from the inside, the specific combination of loss and rage, and the need to direct both towards something purposeful that his own psychology had been organized around since Crime Alley. He recognized in Jason Todd someone whose damage was legible to him because it was his damage in a younger and less disciplined form. And the recognition produced in him the specific form of affection that people feel for the versions of themselves they might have been under different circumstances. The decision to bring Jason into the operation was the most consequential act of hubris in Bruce Wayne's career. Though it did not present itself as hubris at the time, it presented itself as mentorship, as the responsible response to a young person whose circumstances had produced capabilities and orientations that, left without direction, would produce outcomes that neither the young person nor Gotham could afford. Bruce told himself that he was providing what Alfred had once provided him: the structure, the training, the sense of purpose that had converted his own damage into something that served rather than simply consumed. He told himself that the Robin identity was a gift, an opportunity, a path toward the kind of meaningful existence that his own choices had made possible. He told himself these things with the genuine conviction of someone who believed them, and the genuine conviction did not make them true. What he was actually doing, beneath the sincere intentions, was recruiting a child soldier for his personal war, taking a damaged and vulnerable young person and shaping them according to the requirements of a mission rather than the requirements of a healthy human life, substituting operational capability for psychological development, treating the formation of a person as a problem of training rather than a problem of care. The specific curriculum of Jason's preparation was the clearest evidence of what Bruce actually believed was being built. The physical training was comprehensive and rigorous in the way that Bruce's own training had been comprehensive and rigorous, designed to produce a body capable of the specific demands of the operational environment, optimized for the functional requirements of the mission, with the same thoroughness that Bruce applied to every instrument in his operation. The tactical education covered the full range of capabilities that the work required: combat disciplines, detective methodology, the use of technology, the analysis of criminal psychology, the specific techniques of psychological warfare that Batman's approach had developed across years of operational refinement. All of this was genuine and carefully constructed and reflected real investment of time and attention and expertise. None of it was adequate preparation for a healthy human life. None of it addressed the specific psychological needs of a young person who had been damaged by loss and whose damage required not the conversion of rage into operational effectiveness, but the patient, sustained engagement with the specific qualities of hurt and grief and the need for connection and belonging that the rage was covering. Bruce could see the rage. He could not see what was beneath it, or chose not to see it, because what was beneath it was too familiar, and he had long since learned to treat the familiar wound as a resource rather than as a condition requiring care. The isolation that the Robin identity imposed on Jason was a specific, serious harm that the training's genuine benefits could not offset. The operational security requirements of the partnership required Jason to maintain the same fundamental concealment that Bruce maintained to live a double life at an age when the developmental work of establishing a single, integrated identity had barely begun, to maintain secrets from every relationship in his surface life that made genuine intimacy structurally impossible, to understand himself primarily in terms of a function and a mission, rather than in terms of the ordinary accumulation of experience and relationship and gradual self-discovery through which young people normally come to understand who they are. The psychological dependencies this produced were not incidental side effects of necessary operational constraints. They were the specific, predictable consequences of a training regime that treated its subject as a weapon to be developed rather than a person to be supported, that provided operational sophistication at the direct expense of the social and emotional development that the operational sophistication was displacing. Jason became increasingly capable and increasingly isolated simultaneously, the two processes running in parallel because they were two expressions of the same underlying approach to his formation, the approach that understood him as Batman's partner before understanding him as a person. The Joker understood this before Bruce did. The specific quality of intelligence that the Joker possessed, the hyper-rational engagement with human psychological architecture that his transformation had produced, the ability to analyze the mechanisms of identity and vulnerability with a precision unclouded by the empathy that normally prevents such analysis from being conducted at its full depth, allowed him to read the specific profile that Jason's formation had created with a clarity that Bruce, who was too close and too invested in the story he was telling himself about what he had done, could not achieve. The Joker saw in Jason not the trained and capable partner that Bruce saw, but the specific combination of dependence, unprocessed grief, suppressed rage, and the particular vulnerability of someone whose sense of self had been built entirely around a relationship and a mission that could be targeted, someone who had been prepared by the specific choices made in his formation to be destroyed by exactly the right kind of sustained attention from exactly the right kind of adversary. The capture was not accidental. It was a surgical operation conducted by someone who understood precisely what he was taking and precisely what taking it would accomplish. The Joker had identified in Jason the most efficient available mechanism for reaching Batman, more efficient than any physical threat, more efficient than any criminal scheme, more efficient than any of the elaborate philosophical provocations that their long antagonism had produced, because the specific harm of taking Jason was not the harm of taking a partner, but the harm of taking a mirror, of removing from Bruce the young version of himself that he had been trying to protect and direct and give a better outcome than his own, of forcing him to witness the destruction of the version of the wound that he had believed, against all available evidence, could be healed through the right combination of purpose and training, and the kind of love that expressed itself through capability rather than tenderness. What followed in the months of Jason's captivity was not torture in the terminant, simple sense of pain inflicted for the purpose of producing compliance or extracting information. It was the most methodical and sophisticated act of psychological demolition that the Arkham universe produced, a comprehensive dismantling of identity conducted by an expert who understood identity as a constructed artifact that could be deconstructed with sufficient precision and sufficient time. The Joker did not simply hurt Jason. He studied him first, studied the specific architecture of beliefs and attachments, and the particular form of self-understanding that the training had produced, and then addressed each element of that architecture with the specific kind of attention that dismantles rather than builds, that removes rather than adds, that strips away each layer of the constructed self until what remains is not the core of the person, but the wound around which the person had been constructed, exposed and raw, and without any of the psychological infrastructure that had previously given it meaning and direction. The techniques were sophisticated because the Joker's understanding of psychology was sophisticated, the kind of understanding that is liberated from the constraints of empathy, and therefore able to perceive psychological mechanisms with a clarity that empathy's involvement normally prevents. He used combinations of physical pain and psychological manipulation that were calibrated not to break Jason's will in the simple sense, but to demonstrate to Jason that the things he had believed constituted his identity could not survive the conditions they were now being subjected to, that the commitments and the relationships and the sense of purpose that had seemed foundational were actually contingent, that the story he had been told about who he was and what he was doing had been constructed for operational purposes rather than his own flourishing, and therefore could not provide the kind of existential ground that genuine identity requires. The revelations about Batman's nature that the Joker incorporated into the process were not lies. They were true things, or true enough things, selected and arranged to produce the specific conclusion that the process required, the conclusion that the mentor had created in Jason a weapon rather than a person, that the care expressed through capability had been the care of someone who needed a partner, rather than the care of someone who genuinely wanted a flourishing human being to exist in the world, that the mission had always been more important to Bruce than the person serving it. Jason could not refute these revelations from inside the experience of the captivity. The specific conditions of what he was being subjected to had removed all of the psychological infrastructure that might have provided a stable position from which to evaluate them, the relationships, the sense of purpose, the operational identity that had been the primary content of his self-understanding. Stripped of these, confronted with an analysis of his own formation that was accurate in its most wounding elements, even where it was distorted in its framing, he was left with the specific experience of someone who has discovered that the ground they were standing on was not as solid as they believed, not the ordinary, disorienting discovery of impermanence that is part of normal psychological development, but the specific catastrophic version of that discovery that occurs when the impermanence is demonstrated through sustained and expert assault, when the ground does not simply shift, but is systematically removed by someone who understands exactly how it was constructed and exactly what removing each element will produce. What emerged from the captivity was a specific argument about what Batman's method of making allies actually built. The Arkham Knight that Jason became was not simply Jason Todd with accumulated grievance. It was a new psychological construction assembled from the fragments of the old one, according to specifications provided by the process that had destroyed the original, a personality whose every feature was a precise inversion of what Bruce Wayne had intended to create. The military expertise was real, and the strategic capability was genuine, and the intimate knowledge of Batman's methods and vulnerabilities was both comprehensive and tactically devastating. All of these were the direct products of the training Bruce had provided, the capabilities that the operational investment in Jason's formation had genuinely produced. But they were now organized around a purpose that was the exact opposite of the purpose they had been developed to serve, deployed against the person who had developed them, using the specific insider knowledge of that person's psychology and operational patterns that only the most trusted and most deeply formed relationship could have provided. Bruce had created the most effective adversary he would ever face by creating the partner he had most genuinely invested in, had built through the specific choices of Jason's formation, a weapon whose eventual orientation could not have been designed more precisely for his destruction, if that had been the purpose from the beginning. The armor and the identity of the Arkham Knight completed the transformation in a way that the psychological reconstruction alone could not have achieved. The specific function of the visual presentation, the equipment that evoked Batman's own aesthetic, while inverting its moral valence. The armor that created a physical barrier between Jason's damaged interior and the world, while serving as a constant external reminder of what he had become, was the function that Bruce Wayne's entire operation served for. Bruce Wayne, the function of converting inner disorder into outer capability, of giving formlessness a form and purposelessness a purpose, of making the wound into a weapon. Jason had learned this from the person who had taught it most thoroughly. He had applied it with the precision of a student who had understood the lesson at its deepest level. And the lesson, applied with this precision in this direction, was the clearest single demonstration available of what the lesson actually was, not heroism, not the conversion of suffering into service, but the specific practice of using damage as fuel for a mission whose relationship to the damage's original cause was not resolution but perpetuation, not healing but the organized and effective deployment of wound energy toward outcomes whose primary purpose was to prove over and over in every operational engagement that the wound existed and that it mattered, and that the world needed to know both. Bruce Wayne looked at what Jason had become and saw the consequence of the Joker's intervention. He could not afford to see it as the consequence of his own. The specific architecture of his psychology, the wound that was also the foundation, the story that was also the blind spot required that the Joker be the cause, because the Joker was already integrated into his operational understanding as the force whose chaos his order was always opposing, the adversary whose capacity for destruction was the justification for everything his methods required. Accepting that Jason's destruction was at least as much the product of his own formation as of the Joker's demolition would have required accepting that the methods he had applied to his most personally invested operational. The relationship had built the specific vulnerability that the Joker had subsequently exploited, that the training had not been protection but preparation, not strengthening, but the systematic construction of exactly the kind of person that the Joker's approach would find most efficiently destructible. This was the truth about what had happened. It was also the truth that Bruce Wayne's psychology had been designed, since Crime Alley, to prevent him from fully inhabiting. He had failed Jason. The failure was not the Joker's intervention. The failure was everything that had preceded the intervention and made the intervention possible. Everything that had been done in genuine love and genuine commitment and the genuine desire to give a damaged young person a better outcome than the damage alone would have produced. The intentions had been real. The love had been real. And neither the intentions nor the love had been enough, because neither of them had been what Jason actually needed. And what Jason actually needed was the one thing that Bruce Wayne's specific psychology had been organized, from the beginning, around not being able to provide. Barbara Gordon chose. This is the first and most important distinction between her story and the stories of the people around her, whose lives were shaped by Batman's presence in Gotham, the distinction that makes her trajectory both more comprehensible and more heartbreaking than the trajectories of those who were recruited or inherited or simply caught in the operational gravity of a mission they had not sought. Jim Gordon did not choose Batman. He was presented with a fait accompli, a vigilante, already operating in his city, already producing results he could not replicate through legitimate means, already embedded in the operational reality of Gotham's crime landscape before Gordon had any opportunity to decide whether the partnership was something he wanted. Jason Todd did not choose, in any meaningful sense. He was recognized and recruited at an age when the developmental conditions for genuine autonomous choice were not yet present. Shaped by a process that preceded his capacity to fully evaluate what was being offered and what was being taken, Barbara chose. She examined the available evidence about what Batman's mission was and what it required and what it cost, assessed her own capabilities and commitments against those requirements, and made a deliberate adult decision to enter the world that the evidence described. The choice was real. Its consequences were real. And the specific tragedy of what those consequences produced was inseparable from the reality of the choice, from the fact that someone who had seen clearly enough to choose clearly had nevertheless been unable to see what the choosing would eventually cost the people she loved. Her initial adoption of the Batgirl identity was motivated by the same fundamental impulse that had motivated Bruce Wayne's first descent into the cave: the recognition that the world contained injustice at a scale that the legitimate channels available to her were inadequate to address. The specific frustration of someone with genuine capability who had encountered the specific limitations that institutional frameworks impose on that capability. The desire to be effective in the full sense of the word, rather than in the partial sense that operating within constraints permitted. She was not naive about the risks. She understood, entering the work, that vigilantism carried costs that conventional crime fighting did not: the physical costs, the legal exposure, the specific vulnerability of operating without the institutional protections that legitimate law enforcement provided. She accepted these costs as the price of the effectiveness she was seeking, as the necessary conditions of the form of service she had chosen. She understood the transaction, what she could not fully understand, because understanding it would have required a perspective that was only available from outside the experience, rather than inside it, was the specific nature of the additional cost that her father's particular position in Batman's operational world had added to the transaction without her knowledge or her consent. The Joker understood her father's position. He understood it with the specific clarity that his analysis of Batman's psychological architecture provided: the clarity that saw in Gordon not simply a law enforcement ally, but a structural vulnerability, a person whose connection to Batman was intimate enough and whose love for his family was genuine enough to function as a reliable instrument of pressure whenever the operational logic required pressure to be applied. The attack on Barbara was not an expression of the Joker's generalized appetite for chaos. It was a targeted operation, a specific strike at a specific structural weakness in Batman's operational environment, designed to produce specific effects in specific people who would carry those effects forward in specific ways that served the Joker's ongoing philosophical argument with the man in the cave. Barbara was not the target. She was the instrument. The distinction is the most important and most painful thing about what happened to her: the fact that she was selected not for anything she had done or chosen or become, but for the specific relationship she had with a man whose choices had made her a legitimate object of operational targeting by the most sophisticated adversary in the city. The physical injury was devastating in the immediate sense that all serious physical injuries are devastating. the shock of the body's sudden altered reality, the specific quality of the days and weeks that follow when the mind is still operating on the assumption of capacities that the body no longer possesses, the long and uncertain process of learning what recovery means when recovery cannot mean return. But the physical injury was also, in the specific context of who Barbara was and what she had been building, the instrument of a different and more enduring transformation, not simply the ending of the Batgirl identity, which the physical reality of the injury made impossible to continue, but the beginning of something that the injury's specific nature and its specific context made both necessary and available. She could not continue what she had been doing. She was also, by this point, someone whose understanding of Gotham's information landscape and whose capability for the analysis of complex operational situations had developed to a degree that made a different form of engagement not just possible, but genuinely powerful. The transformation into Oracle was not the story of someone diminished by injury finding a compensatory role. It was the story of someone whose injury forced a reorientation that her own psychology might not have produced voluntarily, a reorientation toward a form of capability that exceeded in some crucial respects the form it replaced. The Oracle role gave Barbara a perspective that Batgirl had never possessed: the elevated, comprehensive view of the entire operational landscape that the information systems she built and maintained provided. The ability to see patterns and connections across the full scope of the city's criminal and institutional activity that the street-level engagement of direct action had always obscured. She became, in this role, the most informationally powerful person in Batman's operational network, the node through which intelligence flowed and was processed and returned as actionable guidance, the analytical capacity that gave the network's physical capabilities their strategic direction. The technological systems she developed were genuinely extraordinary, unprecedented in their scope, sophisticated in their design, effective in ways that justified the investment they required. They were also, in the specific way that all surveillance systems are also the things they monitor, instruments whose operation raised questions about the values organizing their use, that the operational pressure of the work consistently deferred rather than addressed. The godlike perspective that the Oracle role provided was not without its specific costs. The omniscient view of the city's activity, the ability to observe everything and direct from a position of comprehensive awareness produced, across the years of its operation, a specific quality of detachment from the human consequences of the information being processed and the decisions being enabled. This was not indifference. It was the specific effect of the role's structure on the psychology of the person performing it, the effect that any position of comprehensive observation produces when it is maintained across sufficient time, the gradual shift from engagement with the human reality of what is being observed toward engagement with the analytical patterns it represents. The transformation of persons into data points that is the occupational hazard of every form of work that requires the processing of human suffering at industrial scale. Barbara was aware of this tendency. She was also powerless to prevent it through awareness alone, because the tendency was structural rather than attitudinal, produced by the nature of the role rather than by any failure of her commitment to the people her work was designed to serve. The isolation that characterized her existence in the Oracle role was not simply the isolation of physical limitation, though the physical reality of her injury contributed to it in ways that were real and that she navigated with the specific combination of intelligence and determination that characterized everything she did. It was also the isolation of the position itself, the specific loneliness of someone who sees everything and can act on almost nothing, who processes the full scope of the city's suffering and directs others toward its amelioration without being able to participate in that amelioration in the direct physical way that Batgirl had once permitted. She was the eye that saw and the voice that guided, and the eye and the voice, however essential they were to the operation of the network they served, were not the hands that acted, and the hands that acted were someone else's hands, and the distance between direction and action is a distance that accumulates across years of sustained operation into a specific quality of psychological remove from the immediate human reality of what the work was for. Her father carried his portion of the cost in the specific currency of guilt, the knowledge that his association with Batman had made her a target, that the choices he had made across years of operational compromise had produced consequences he had neither intended nor foreseen, but that bore the clear and traceable relationship to his choices that consequence always bears to cause. He could not say this to her. The operational security that had always governed his relationship to Batman's world governed his relationship to this specific knowledge as well, wrapping it in the silence that classified information imposes, and leaving him to carry it in the specific isolation of complicity alone, with the understanding that the most devastating thing that had happened to his family was connected to decisions he had made, connected in ways he could not fully articulate, without disclosures that the partnership required him not to make. What Barbara's story added to the account of Batman's operational world was the specific form of evidence that no other story provided, the evidence of what the mission cost the people who entered it with full agency, who made genuine adult choices and accepted genuine operational risks, who were not simply casualties of proximity, but active and committed participants in the work. The others who had paid the price of association with Batman had paid it in ways whose relationship to their own choices was complicated. Gordon, through a series of individually justifiable compromises. Jason, through a formation he had not been fully equipped to evaluate at the time it was offered. Alfred, through a love that predated and transcended the mission entirely. Barbara paid it through a choice she had made clearly and deliberately, with the specific understanding of what the choice entailed that genuine adult agency requires. And the choice had led her here, to the room with the screens, to the voice in the network's ear, to the comprehensive and powerful and fundamentally isolated position that was simultaneously the most complete expression of her capability and the most complete expression of what the capability had been organized around from the beginning, which was not her own flourishing, but the mission's continuation, which was not her life, but Batman's, which was not what she had chosen, but what the logic of the world she had chosen to enter had. With the patient inevitability of a trajectory, following its natural course, produced, she remained. This is the final thing to say about her, and it is the most important that she remained, not out of the absence of alternatives, but out of the specific quality of commitment that had organized her choices from the beginning. The recognition that the work was real and the need was real, and that the fact that the personal cost had exceeded what the initial transaction had appeared to require did not change the reality of either. She had been changed by the cost. She had not been broken by it. The distinction was one that only she could fully measure, and she measured it with the same precision she brought to every other assessment the oracle role required, filing the measurement in the specific place where the things that cannot be changed are stored, and returning to the work. The blood was always the most honest part of the story. Not because blood is honest in any simple metaphorical sense, not because the body's physical reality constitutes a more authentic register of truth than the mind's constructions, but because the specific mechanism of the Joker's infection, the specific means by which his essence entered Batman's system and began its work, was so precisely right as a description of what had actually been happening between them across the entire span of their relationship, that the biological literalism of it barely mattered. The infection was real. It was also a confession about the nature of their connection, about the specific quality of the boundary that separated them, about how long that boundary had been eroding before the erosion became visible in a form that could not be explained away as a tactical assessment or a professional obligation or any of the other frameworks that Bruce Wayne had been using across years of encounters with the Joker to maintain the fiction that what existed between them was a relationship between a guardian and a threat, rather than something considerably more mutual and considerably more intimate. The philosophical infection had been spreading since their first encounter. This is the fact that the blood-borne pathogen made legible, the fact that was always present and always visible to anyone willing to look at the specific character of their engagement across the years, but that the operational framing of their relationship consistently prevented from being clearly seen. Bruce and the Joker had been in a relationship of profound mutual influence from the moment the Joker's existence became known to him, a relationship whose specific character was not the character of a guardian neutralizing a threat, but the character of two people who were philosophically engaged with each other at a level of depth and seriousness that neither of them was willing to fully acknowledge. The Joker had always known this. It was one of the primary sources of his amusement, the specific comedy of a man who was engaged in the most intimate philosophical dialogue of his life, while refusing to acknowledge that the dialogue was happening, who was being changed by every encounter with his most significant adversary, while insisting that the adversary was simply an obstacle to be managed, rather than an interlocutor who was saying something he needed to hear. What the Joker was saying across the entire span of their relationship was a single argument expressed in endlessly varied forms. The argument was about the nature of the order that Batman represented and defended, about whether that order was what it claimed to be, whether the principles it was built on were genuine commitments or convenient frameworks, whether the discipline that sustained it was the expression of genuine moral understanding or the elaborate management of impulses that were exactly as dark as the impulses being managed. He was not arguing that Batman was secretly wicked. He was arguing something more unsettling, that Batman was secretly the same, that the rage and the need and the specific quality of obsession that organized Batman's psychology were not different in kind from the forces that organized his own, that the difference between them was not the difference between order and chaos, but the difference between someone who had built an elaborate structure of discipline and purpose around his damage and someone who had allowed his damage to express itself directly. This was not an argument that Batman could engage with honestly, because engaging with it honestly would have required acknowledging that the Joker understood him at a level that no one else did, that the adversary he had spent his career trying to contain had mapped the architecture of his psychology with greater accuracy than anyone who claimed to be on his side. The various infections that the Joker's blood produced in the people it entered were the most precise demonstration of this argument at a biological scale. Each infected person became a specific variation on the Joker's fundamental theme, not a copy, not a simple reproduction of the Joker's particular expression of the underlying chaos, but a unique manifestation of the darkness that had always existed within the specific individual who received the infection. The transformation was not the introduction of foreign material, but the amplification of material that was already present, the specific contradictions and suppressions and dark corners of each person's psychology, suddenly released from the constraints that had been keeping them in check and given the specific form of expression that the Joker's philosophy, filtered through that individual's particular architecture, naturally produced. This was the Joker's genuine insight, the piece of his understanding of human psychology that went beyond clever manipulation into something that deserved to be called wisdom, even if it was wisdom in service of destruction, the recognition that darkness did not need to be implanted in people because it was already there, that corruption was always already possible because human beings contained the materials for their own corruption and required only the right catalyst to convert those materials from potential into expression. Batman's infection was the argument's culmination. The specific personality that began to emerge in the infected Bruce was not an alien imposition, not the Joker expressing himself through Batman's body, not a foreign consciousness overwriting a native one. It was Bruce. It was the specific version of Bruce that his decades of discipline and suppression and the careful organization of his psychology around the mission's requirements had been preventing from full expression, the rage without the restraint, the obsession without the code. the specific quality of absolute conviction in his own judgment that had always been present at the foundation of everything he did, but that the ethical framework of his operation had been moderating into something that could be functionally distinguished from the conviction that characterized his enemies. The infection did not change him. It revealed him, or began to reveal him, in the way that a chemical process reveals the latent image on a photographic surface that was always there, but not yet visible. The no-kill rule was the specific element of Batman's operational code whose status the infection made most acutely uncertain, the commitment whose nature, as either genuine moral principle or sophisticated suppression mechanism, became most pressingly unclear as the infection progressed. Bruce had maintained the rule across decades of provocation that would have broken it in any ordinary person, decades of confrontations with people who had caused suffering on scales that made the case for lethal response, not just emotionally compelling but rationally defensible, decades of choosing the harder path of capture and confinement over the simpler path of termination that his capabilities would have made straightforward. The rule was real in the sense that it had been consistently applied. What the infection forced into the open was the question of what it was, whether its consistency represented the stable expression of a genuine philosophical commitment to the sanctity of human life that extended even to the lives of people who threatened that sanctity, or whether it represented the consistent success of a suppression mechanism that had been preventing a different and darker orientation from expressing itself. An orientation that the infection's effects on his psychology were now making available in ways the suppression mechanism could no longer reliably prevent. The Joker had always believed it was suppression. This was the specific claim at the center of the philosophical argument he had been making across their entire relationship, the claim that the code was not principle but control, that what lay beneath the control was not different from what lay beneath his own expression of the same underlying forces, that the discipline was the distance between them rather than the difference. He made this claim through every scheme and every encounter and every elaborately constructed situation designed to force Batman into a position where the code had to be maintained against maximum resistance, where the cost of the principle's maintenance had to be paid in the most vivid possible terms. He was not testing whether Batman could maintain the rule. He understood that Batman could maintain the rule under ordinary conditions. He was testing what maintaining the rule cost, what it revealed about the nature of the thing being constrained, what became visible about the darker material beneath the surface when sufficient pressure was applied to bring it to the edge of expression. The Joker was the most sophisticated reader of Batman's psychology that the Arkham universe produced, and what he read there, across years of intimate adversarial contact, was not a guardian of justice who had achieved genuine moral integration, but a damaged person of extraordinary capability who had constructed an extraordinary apparatus of self-management around damage that had never been addressed, and that the apparatus was, under sufficient stress, increasingly insufficient to contain. The people around Bruce registered the infection's progress in ways that the infected Bruce could not fully perceive from inside his own experience. The specific quality of his judgment began to change, not dramatically, not in ways that made his operational effectiveness obviously diminished, but in the subtle register of the decisions that revealed most about the values organizing his choices. The assessments of acceptable risk shifted in directions that the pre-infection version of his thinking would have flagged as compromised. The calculations about what methods were warranted in what circumstances began to produce answers that departed from the ethical framework he had maintained with such consistency across the previous decades. The emotional distance that had always characterized his engagement with the human beings, his operations affected both the people he was protecting and the people he was engaging with operationally, narrowed in some directions, and expanded in others in ways that reflected the specific shifts the infection was producing in the psychological architecture beneath his operational behavior. The specific irony of the infection was the specific irony of the fast Joker's entire relationship with Batman The irony that the man who had spent his career warning Gotham about the dangers of the darkness that he was holding at bay was, through the process of holding it at bay, becoming the most intimate possible demonstration of what happened when that darkness was given an adequate delivery mechanism. The infection was the delivery mechanism, but the material it was delivering was not foreign. The Joker was not infecting Batman with something alien to his nature. He was returning to Batman's nature, the elements of it that Batman's decades of discipline had been most successfully suppressing, not creating a monster, but revealing the specific quality of monstrousness that had always been available in the material his psychology was built from, and that the mission had been directing rather than eliminating. The infected versions of other individuals that the storyline produced were, in this reading, a set of controlled comparisons, a series of experiments demonstrating what happened to different kinds of people when the Joker's influence amplified rather than replaced their existing psychological contents. Each one was recognizable as a distorted version of their original self, each distortion following the specific logic of that individual's particular psychology rather than the logic of some generic corruption. Each one constituted an argument about the relationship between what people were and what they had the capacity to become under the right conditions of pressure and permission. Together, they constituted the Joker's most comprehensive statement about human nature, not the nihilistic claim that human beings were uniformly dark at their cores, but the more specific and more troubling claim that darkness was always available in people as a potential that ordinarily went unactualized, that the conditions preventing its actualization were less robust than the social order required people to believe, and that the appropriate response to this fact was not the construction of more elaborate suppression mechanisms, but the honest acknowledgement that the mechanisms were suppression rather than transformation. Batman's infection was unresolved. The Arkham universe did not provide the clean, dramatic arc of corruption and redemption that simpler narratives would have supplied, did not show the infection running to its conclusion and revealing what Bruce Wayne actually was, beneath everything he had built, nor show the infection overcome through the affirmation of principles that turned out to be genuine rather than suppressive. It left the question open, which was the right artistic choice and the most philosophically honest one, because the question it was asking was not a question about the outcome of a specific medical crisis, but a question about the nature of a specific person's relationship to his own darkness. A question that does not resolve within the time frame of a narrative, but persists as the ongoing organizing tension of a life. Whether the darkness beneath the discipline was evidence of the discipline's failure or evidence of the discipline's necessity remained, at the end of the infection's immediate narrative, as uncertain as it had been at the beginning, and this uncertainty was not a failure of the story, but its most precise achievement. The thing that made it an honest account of what the relationship between Bruce Wayne and the Joker had always actually been about, beneath the operational framework of hero and villain that both of them had inhabited, and neither of them had been simply. The blood was always the most honest part. It said, in the specific language of the body that cannot lie the way that narrative can lie, that the boundary between them had been permeable from the beginning, that what entered through the wound had always been available for entry because what it was delivering home had never entirely left. The protocol had a name before it had a necessity. This is the detail that most clearly reveals what it actually was: not an emergency measure improvised in response to specific circumstances that had made continued operation impossible, but a contingency that had been planned across years of careful preparation, a predetermined response to conditions that Bruce Wayne had identified long in advance as the eventual destination of the trajectory he was on. He had known, at some level, and for a long time, that the trajectory ended here. He had prepared the ending with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every operational challenge, had constructed its components piece by piece across the years of his career, had maintained the readiness of the system that would execute it with the same discipline that maintained every other system in the cave. The Nightfall Protocol was not a decision made under pressure. It was a decision made in advance, and sustained across years. The specific expression of a conviction that had been developing alongside everything else he had built. The conviction that the mission would eventually require the complete sacrifice of the person serving it, and that when that moment arrived, the person needed to be ready. The psychological preparation required to reach this conviction was the most complete expression of what the years of discipline had accomplished. Most people who build their lives around a cause retain, at some level of their self-understanding, the distinction between themselves and the cause, the recognition that they are a person who serves the cause rather than an instance of the cause that happens to be embodied in a person, the understanding that their own continuity has a value independent of the cause's continuity that creates a legitimate claim on their decision-making, even when the cause's interests and their own diverge. Bruce Wayne had spent decades systematically eroding this distinction, treating every form of personal interest that conflicted with the mission's requirements as a weakness to be overcome, subordinating every attachment and every preference and every ordinary human desire for comfort and connection to the overriding imperative of the work. The erosion had been so thorough and so sustained that by the time the Nightfall Protocol became necessary, rather than merely prepared, the distinction it required him to surrender had already largely ceased to exist. He was not sacrificing himself for the mission. He had already become the mission. The protocol was simply the formalization of a conversion that had been underway for decades. The specific circumstances that triggered the activation, the public revelation of his identity as Bruce Wayne, the exposure of the connection between the billionaire and the vigilante that had been the operational foundation of everything he had built, constituted not so much a crisis as a clarification. The exposure made visible what had always been structurally true about the double life, that it was a single life, organized around a concealment that could not survive indefinitely, that the gap between the surface and the underground had been closing throughout the career, even as its maintenance consumed ever-increasing resources and attention, that the question was never whether the separation would eventually fail, but only when and in what form the failure would arrive. What the revelation did was remove the operational option of continuation in the existing form, while simultaneously providing the specific conditions that the protocol required the public attention. The documented exposure, the context within which a dramatic event would generate the kind of unambiguous interpretive response that the protocol was designed to produce. The construction of the deception was the most elaborate psychological operation Bruce Wayne ever conducted, and its subject was not Gotham's criminal population or any of the specific adversaries whose psychology he had studied and manipulated across his career. Its subject was everyone, the criminals and the allies and the oversight bodies and the general public and the intimate few who had known him most deeply, every consciousness that had any relationship to the myth he had built, and whose response to the myth's apparent ending needed to be shaped in specific ways to produce the outcomes the protocol required. The forensic evidence was prepared with the precision of someone who understood exactly how the investigation that followed would be conducted, what conclusions, specific arrangements of physical evidence would produce in the minds of specific investigators operating under specific institutional frameworks, how the standard methodology of a death investigation could be led to a predetermined conclusion through the careful management of the materials that methodology would encounter. He was not simply faking a death. He was constructing a reality, a complete and internally consistent version of events that would satisfy the specific epistemological requirements of every audience whose belief in it was necessary for the protocol to achieve its purpose. Alfred's participation in the final walk through Wayne Manor was the most painful element of the protocol's execution, and it was painful in a specific way that the emotional register of the moment, the quiet dignity, the mutual understanding between two men who had shared everything, does not entirely capture. Alfred had spent decades as the anchor that prevented the cave from consuming Bruce entirely, the human presence that maintained the residual connection to the person beneath the mission. His participation in the protocol was the final expression of that role, not the maintenance of the person against the mission's encroachment, but the acknowledgement that the mission had won, that the person had been fully converted to the mission's requirements, that what remained of Bruce Wayne was what the mission required, rather than what Alfred had been trying to preserve. He walked beside the man he loved into the final act of a story whose conclusion he had probably anticipated for years. And the calm that characterized his bearing in that moment was not the calm of someone at peace with the outcome, but the calm of someone who had made his peace with the outcome long enough ago that the peace had become permanent. A grief processed across years rather than experienced fresh in the moment of its expression. The explosion did what the protocol required it to do. It produced a public event of sufficient scale and unambiguity to anchor the interpretation that followed a physical fact around which the narrative of Batman's death could organize itself without requiring the sustained maintenance of a deception, because the explosion was real, even if its meaning was constructed, a genuine catastrophe that had been deployed in service of a manufactured significance. Gotham's response to the apparent death revealed with unusual clarity what Batman's decades of operation had actually produced in the culture around him, not the empowered citizenry that the most idealistic framings of his mission had imagined, not a population that had been strengthened by his example into a greater capacity for collective self-protection, but a population whose primary response to the news that he was gone was the specific quality of fear that belongs to people who have been protected rather than protected themselves, who have transferred their own civic agency to an external figure, and who discover, when that figure is removed, that the agency they surrendered is not easily recovered. The grief was genuine, the fear was genuine, and both the grief and the fear were, in the most precise sense, Batman's creations, the specific emotional consequences of the specific relationship he had cultivated with Gotham across his career, the relationship that had made him indispensable rather than unnecessary, that had made the city dependent rather than capable, that had made his eventual absence a crisis rather than the occasion for the exercise of a civic resilience he had helped to build. The emergence of new vigilantes in the aftermath was the inheritance the protocol actually produced, not the institutional strengthening that the idealistic account of his mission had always pointed toward, not the reformed police department or the improved prosecutorial systems, or the political accountability that genuine institutional work might have generated, but more people doing what he had done, more individuals deciding that the extra-legal approach was the necessary approach, more iterations of the specific dynamic whose long-term consequences his own career had been demonstrating. They were inspired by the symbol. The symbol had taught them that the symbol was sufficient, that individual capability deployed outside institutional frameworks was the appropriate response to Gotham's problems, that the question of accountability and legitimacy and the long-term health of democratic institutions was a question that the urgency of operational necessity had rendered temporarily irrelevant. The lesson was the lesson of everything he had built, and the new vigilantes had learned it exactly as it had been taught. The question of whether Bruce Wayne survived the explosion, whether the Nightfall Protocol was a final ending or a transition to a different form of the same operation, was deliberately left without a definitive answer, and the deliberateness of this ambiguity was itself a piece of the protocol's design. A confirmed death would have provided closure, would have given the criminals who feared him and the allies who depended on him and the general public whose relationship to the symbol organized their understanding of Gotham's safety a definitive endpoint around which to reorient themselves. Ambiguity provided something more valuable from the protocol's operational perspective, the continuation of the psychological deterrent that had always been the primary mechanism of Batman's crime-fighting approach. Not the physical presence, but the perceived possibility of presence. Not the certainty of intervention, but the uncertainty of its absence. He understood that the symbol's power derived not from what it actually was, but from what it was believed to be, and that belief could survive physical absence in ways that physical presence could not always sustain. The ambiguity was the final gift of the operational intelligence that had organized his entire career, the conversion of an apparent ending into a continued mechanism, the transformation of what looked like defeat into a different form of the same strategy. What the protocol could not accomplish, despite the extraordinary sophistication of its design and execution, was the resolution of the fundamental question that the entire architecture of Bruce Wayne's life had been organized around the question that Crime Alley had posed when he was 8 years old, and that every subsequent choice had responded to without ever fully answering. The question was not whether he could be effective enough. He had demonstrated effectiveness at a scale that no individual in Gotham's history had approached. The question was whether effectiveness was sufficient, whether the mission that had organized his entire psychology and consumed everyone and everything that had come close to him and produced Arkham Asylum and the Joker and Jason, Todd's destruction and Barbara Gordon's injury and Jim Gordon's corruption had actually accomplished what a good life required, accomplishing whether the specific form of service he had chosen was the right form of service or merely the most psychologically available one. The form that his specific wound in its specific configuration had made not just possible but inevitable. The protocol answered this question only in the negative, only by demonstrating that the mission had reached a point where continuation required the sacrifice of the last residue of the person, where the logic that had been consuming everything had finally consumed everything available to consume. This was not a resolution. It was the final measurement of the distance between what Bruce Wayne had intended and what Bruce Wayne had built, expressed in the specific terms of a man walking with his oldest companion through the house that had sheltered both the surface life and the underground one, preparing to erase both in the service of a symbol that had long since become more real to him than either. The mission had won. This was exactly what the mission required. And whether what the mission required and what a human life was for were the same question remained, as the manor burned, as unresolved as it had been in the alley where everything began, patient and permanent and immune to the most extraordinary acts of will and capability and sacrifice, waiting in the specific darkness that no symbol and no protocol and no degree of preparation had ever been sufficient to fully illuminate. And so Gotham settles into its particular darkness. And the question that has organized this long chronicle settles with it, not answered, not resolved, but present in the way that the most honest questions are always present, patient and permanent in the specific silence that follows the end of a story that was never quite finished. The rain that the city produces in such abundance, that falls against the asylum windows and pools in the craters of streets that have absorbed too much violence for too many decades, continues to fall without reference to the events that have occurred within its duration. The city does not mark the end of things. It simply continues, and the continuation is its own kind of statement, the refusal of a specific geography and the human density inhabiting it to organize themselves around the conclusions that the individuals within them have reached. The persistence of ordinary life alongside and beneath and through the extraordinary circumstances that the chronicles of this particular place consistently produce. Bruce Wayne is somewhere in this city, or is not. The question has been deliberately left without a definitive answer, and the deliberateness of the ambiguity is itself a kind of answer, not to the factual question of his physical location, but to the deeper question of what his presence or absence actually constituted, what the difference was between Batman existing and Batman not existing in terms of what Gotham actually needed and whether what it had received was that. The symbol persists regardless. This was always the point. The symbol was designed to persist beyond the person, to outlast the specific body and the specific psychology that had given it initial expression, to continue exerting the deterrent effect of its presence in the imagination of the people who feared it, even when the physical reality that had originally justified their fear had been removed or altered beyond recognition. Whether this was wisdom or the final expression of a psychology that had never been able to distinguish between controlling the narrative and genuinely serving the people the narrative was meant to protect, is a question that the city, settling into its rain-soaked dark, does not pause to ask. We are all, in some measure, building something from a wound. We are all, in some measure, unable to see clearly the thing we have built because we are standing inside it, because the structure that surrounds us is also the structure that constitutes us, because the distance required for honest assessment is the distance that the wound's organizing logic most reliably prevents. This is not a condition unique to the damaged and extraordinary. It is the ordinary condition of being a person, the specific limitation of self-knowledge that comes from the fundamental inability to stand outside one's own psychology and observe it with the detachment that genuine clarity would require. What is unusual about Bruce Wayne is not that he built something from a wound that he could not see clearly. What is unusual is the scale of what he built, and the specific nature of the wound it was built from, and the specific quality of the intelligence and capability and absolute commitment that he brought to the building, which amplified the ordinary limitations of self-knowledge into something whose consequences extended to every person who came within the operational radius of what he was creating. The Joker was not wrong about everything. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable conclusion that an honest engagement with the Arkham universe produces, not the comfortable conclusion that the chaos was simply evil and the order was simply good, and the tragedy lay in the good's insufficient insulation from the evil's corrupting influence, but the more disturbing conclusion that the Joker's analysis of Batman's psychology was substantially accurate, that the argument he had been making across their entire relationship about the nature of the order that Batman represented was not simply the rationalization of a nihilist, but a genuine philosophical claim that the evidence of Batman's career consistently supported. The darkness beneath the discipline was real. The suppression was real. The specific quality of the wound at the foundation of everything, the wound that had organized a life rather than been addressed by one, was real. And its reality shaped the outcomes of the mission in ways that the mission's stated purposes could not account for. The Joker was not right about what followed from this. The answer to the revelation that order conceals darkness is not the embrace of chaos, but the revelation itself was accurate, and the accuracy of it is what made the relationship between them something more than the simple opposition of hero and villain that the surface narrative provided. Gotham produced Batman, which means that Gotham produced what Batman became, which means that the city that needed protecting was also the city that generated the specific forces that made the protection produce its own forms of damage. This circularity is not a paradox to be resolved, but a reality to be inhabited, the specific reality of any complex system in which the responses to problems become components of the problems they were designed to address, in which the solutions and the conditions requiring them are expressions of the same underlying dynamic rather than independent phenomena with a simple causal relationship. Batman did not save Gotham from itself. He participated in Gotham's ongoing self-production, contributing to the specific ecology of violence and response and escalation and counter-escalation that the city had been generating across decades of institutional failure and social inequality, and the specific forms of human desperation that sufficient inequality reliably produces. He was not incidental to this ecology. He was one of its most significant contributors, not through malice, not through failure of commitment, but through the specific ways that his particular approach to the city's problems fed back into the conditions that made those problems intractable. Jim Gordon is somewhere in this city, carrying what he has always carried, the specific weight of a career's worth of compromises, each individually justifiable and collectively constituting the abandonment of the principles that the career was built to serve. He is not a corrupt man. He never became a corrupt man. He became something more complicated and in some ways more troubling, a principled man whose principles had been systematically applied in service of a partnership whose long-term effects on those principles had been corrosive, rather than sustaining. A guardian of the law who had spent decades enabling the most significant extra-legal operation in Gotham's history, because the operation produced outcomes that the law alone had been unable to produce. The cost of this is not payable in any currency that the city recognizes. It is payable only in the specific interior currency of a life examined honestly, and the examination is ongoing. Barbara Gordon is in her room with her screens, seeing everything that can be seen from the position of her injury and her choices, and the specific logic of the world she entered have produced for her. The perspective is extraordinary. The isolation is real. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither of them resolves the other. And the work continues, because the work continuing is what she chose. And the choice was genuine, even when its full consequences were not visible at the time of choosing. She is perhaps the most honest person in this chronicle, the person whose clarity about what she was doing and why was most complete, whose assessment of the available options was most rigorous, whose decision to remain in the work despite a full accounting of its costs was most genuinely voluntary. The honesty does not make the costs smaller. It makes the person paying them more clearly visible as a person rather than a casualty. Jason Todd is somewhere in the world, carrying the specific wreckage of a formation that was done to him by someone who loved him and who did not understand, because the specific architecture of that person's psychology prevented understanding. That love, expressed through the conversion of a person into an instrument, is not love that the person can use. The love was real. The harm was also real. Both are part of the accounting. The resolution of that accounting, whether the person who was damaged by being made into a weapon can eventually become, through whatever combination of distance and time, and whatever resources for recovery the world outside Batman's operational environment might provide. Something other than the damage is the one genuinely open question in this chronicle, the one whose answer is not already determined by the trajectory that produced it, the one that belongs entirely to Jason rather than to the mission that believed it owned him. Alfred is present throughout all of this in the way that the foundational elements of a structure are present, not visible on the surface, but constitutive of everything above them, the thing without which none of the rest would stand. Whether he survived the protocol in any form that resembles the continuity of the person rather than simply the continuity of the function is part of the deliberate ambiguity that the chronicle maintains at its end. What is not ambiguous is what he represented across the full span of the story, the specific form of love that is organized entirely around the welfare of another person rather than around any need or benefit of one's own. The love that sees clearly what the beloved is becoming and stays regardless, because the staying is what the love requires, even when the staying enables the becoming. This is not a simple form of goodness. It is a complicated one, shaped by the specific impossibility of the situation into something that contains both the highest expression of human devotion and a form of enabling whose consequences extended to everyone who paid a price for Batman's existence. Both things are true. Alfred knew both things were true. He stayed anyway, because some forms of love are not compatible with the clear-eyed assessment of their own consequences. And the incompatibility is not a flaw in the love, but a feature of its nature. We carry our wounds differently, all of us. Some of us build from them with the specific quality of obsessive commitment that Bruce Wayne brought to his building, the absolute refusal to allow the wound to simply be what it was, the insistence on converting it into purpose, on making the damage productive, on ensuring that what was done to us does not simply exist as something done to us, but becomes the organizing principle of everything we subsequently do. This is a recognizable and often admirable human response to injury. It produces extraordinary things. It also produces, as a structural byproduct of the conversion process, the specific inability to see the wound clearly that comes from having built so much on top of it, the specific blindness that afflicts people who have made their damage into their foundation, who cannot examine the foundation without risking the stability of everything constructed above it. Rest now. The city will hold what it holds through the hours of the dark without reference to your attention or your anxiety. The questions that Batman's story poses about what we build from damage and what the building costs, and whether the people we love pay prices they never agreed to pay for structures they never fully understood, are not questions that require resolution tonight. They require only the specific quality of honest acknowledgement that this long chronicle has been attempting the willingness to look at the full accounting rather than the summary, at the costs alongside the achievements, at what the mission built alongside what it protected, at the wound beneath the symbol alongside the symbol itself. Let the rain find the windows. Let the darkness be what it is, without the specific violence of insisting that it be held at bay by a single will, however extraordinary. Let the city breathe in the specific way that cities breathe, when the extraordinary has passed and the ordinary has reasserted itself imperfectly, with all its unresolved contradictions intact, alive in the specific way that things are alive, when they have survived more than they were designed to survive, and have become, through the surviving, something that simple design could never have produced. The question of what we become, while holding the darkness back, will still be there in the morning. It is patient in the way that all the most important questions are patient, accustomed to waiting, indifferent to the urgency with which we move past it, present in the specific silence between the things we say about ourselves and the things that we are. Sleep now, guardian of Gotham's darkest hours. The watch is ended for tonight. The darkness keeps its own counsel, and the morning, when it comes, will ask its honest questions gently, the way that the most necessary things always arrive, not with violence, but with the quiet persistence of something that was always there, waiting only for the silence required to be heard.